What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
I have pepper spray, and I swear I'll use it. But I want you to know I understand the Negro people. I understand how you've been chained down by the oppression of white capitalist society.
Yes, well, then you'll understand this.
On April 18, 2025, Warner Brothers released Ryan Coogler's highly anticipated film Sinners, marking his first feature since directing and co-writing the MCU's box office-shattering Black Panther and Wakanda Forever. Sinners, set in 1932, follows the preacher's son Sammy, who's given the chance to play the blues when his identical twin cousins, Smoke and Stack, return to their hometown of Clarksdale, Mississippi, with money stolen from rival gangs, to purchase a sawmill which they plan to turn into a juke joint for the local black community. But when supernatural forces show up uninvited, Sammy and the twins must fight to keep their dreams from going up in flames. With a budget of $90 million, the film had a global debut of $63 million, making it the biggest debut for an original movie since Jordan Peele's Us, released in 2019. And as of June 30th, Sinners has grossed over $364 million globally, making it the second highest grossing horror movie of all time and the highest grossing live-action original film domestically in the past 15 years. And now that Sinners is available on HBO Max, I want to explore the depiction of black vampires in media and how vampirism can be used, much like a longitudinal study, to track the lives of black people in the Americas over time. But to do that, first we're going to have to start with the origin of the modern-day vampire. But before we get to that, I'm Kareem, welcome to Prism, where we use pop culture as a prism to better understand the world around us. If that sounds good to you, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you know each time I post. So the year is 1725, when a Kislejevan peasant named Petar Blagojevich dies of unknown causes, and within 8 days following his death, 9 more Kislejevan villagers also die of unknown causes. Now, while this in and of itself wasn't all that remarkable, what stood out was that each of the soon-to-be deceased claimed to have been paid a visit from Petar Blagojevich, who was well beyond the grave. What's even stranger is that Blagojevich's widow also claimed to have been visited at night by her late husband. The locals, growing fearsome, decided to summon a priest along with imperial provisor Ernst Frumbald and an official of the Austrian monarchy to oversee the exhumation and examination of Blagojevich's body. Frumbald, incredibly skeptical that there was any vampiric activity going on, insisted that the locals wait for permission from Austrian authorities, but they refused, arguing that entire villages had been wiped out by creatures like Blagojevich back when Kislejevo was still under the jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire. And when the locals threatened to leave their town for good if he didn't act, Frumbald had no choice but to give in. So Frumbald exhumed the body, and to everyone's surprise, Petar Blagojevich was found, undecomposed, with a swollen belly, new skin, new nails, and wait for it, blood leaking from his mouth. All signs pointing towards vampirism. The locals, believing this to be proof of the corpse's misdeeds, decided to drive a stake through Blagojevich's heart and burn his body for extra measure, ensuring he wouldn't be able to strike again. Frumbald, at the conclusion of his report, had only one wish: not to be blamed for the actions of the locals. But it was already too late. Frumbald's report was published by the Wienerisches Diarium, a Viennese newspaper, and began to spread to countries like France, Germany, England, and by the late 1800s, even the United States of America, inspiring copycats who blamed tuberculosis outbreaks on reanimated corpses who subsisted on the blood of the living and would even go as far as to exhume the bodies and desecrate them for fear of hematophagy. And thus, the myth of the vampire as we know it was born. Now, with the advancement of the printing press in 1798, oral histories are no longer sufficient. It's not enough to just hear a story about vampires. Those who can want to read a story about vampires. And it's in April 1819 that we get John William Polidori's The Vampire, which is considered to be the first modern vampire story in English literature. The story's set in London, and it follows a mysterious and seductive Lord Ruthven who's revealed to be an aristocratic vampire who preys on young women. The story, however short it may be, is incredibly significant because it establishes the conventions of the romantic vampire genre, perhaps the most prevalent genre in vampire media today. And what's interesting is that a month after Polidori's The Vampire is published, we get the very first literary depiction depiction of a black vampire in Uriah Derrick D'Arcy's short story called The Black Vampire, A Legend of St. Domingo, which follows an unnamed African prince who, at just the age of 10, is kidnapped from the eastern coast of Guinea, where he's brought and sold to a plantation owner named Mr. Person in St. Domingo, which is modern-day Haiti. So when the boat docks in Haiti, we learn that a yacht outbreak has claimed the lives of every black person aboard the ship, except this incredibly skinny 10-year-old boy, and Mr. Person, believing the boy to be too feeble to perform physical labor, decides to kill him by knocking his brains out, and then discarding his body in the ocean, but later comes to find out that the boy is still alive as he stumbles upon him on the shore later that night. Mr. Person, shocked, attempts to kill the boy once again by tying a stone around him and throwing him back in the ocean, but the boy rises out of the water with the stone in hand. This enrages Mr. Person, who orders his servants to light the boy on fire as he holds him down, but when ignited, the boy's body does not burn. It doesn't even seem to be affected by the flames. Mr. Person, however, does after the boy sets him ablaze, causing Mr. Person to become disfigured. So the boy disappears, and later in the story, Mr. Person's infant son also vanishes, and all that's left behind is his hair and nails, causing a grief-stricken Mr. Person to die from shock, leaving behind his widow Euphemia, who remarries twice more. Both of her husbands die mysterious deaths. So years later, an African prince appears with a white man named Zimbo. And spoiler alert, the African prince is the boy that was enslaved by Mr. Person, and Zimbo is the missing infant son of Mr. Person. So the prince successfully seduces Euphemia and becomes husband number 4. On their wedding night, the two consummate their marriage by performing an obeah ritual, which entails exhuming the body of Euphemia's dead child and having her drink its blood from a golden goblet. Okay? So the African prince then resurrects Euphemia's first 3 husbands, 2 of whom start fighting over Euphemia's hand in marriage. The African prince, growing impatient, decides to kill the 2 but spares Mr. Person, who he then takes with him to an anti-capitalist vampire ball, where he ultimately delivers a speech about the emancipation of Negroes. Now, while this book is also pretty short, it's very significant, not just because it depicts the first black vampire in Western literature, but also because of its abolitionist themes, with D'Arcy suggesting that the real vampires, parasites, if you will, of our society are capitalists, slave owners, and those who profit off of the labor of others. This is a story where a formerly enslaved black boy gets revenge on his captors, and although it feels anachronistic, it's very representative of the popular sentiment in Haiti during that time period. You see, the book was published 15 years after the Haitian Revolution, which consisted of formerly enslaved, self-liberated black Haitians overthrowing French colonial rule, abolishing slavery in Haiti, and establishing Haiti as the second independent country in the Americas. So in this narrative, vampirism operates as a necessary tool for black resistance and liberation. Now, with the advent of motion pictures, literary transcriptions aren't sufficient. It's not enough to just read a story about vampires. Those who can want to see a story about vampires. And with that, we get F.W. Murnau's 1922 silent film Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, which was questionably adapted from Bram Stoker's 1897 gothic horror novel Dracula. And I say questionably because Murnau was sued by Bram Stoker's estate for adapting the novel without permission. Ultimately, the German court ruled in favor of Stoker's estate, and several prints of the film were destroyed, causing the film to underperform, earning only $27,964 in the box office, which I know some of you are probably thinking back then that was probably a lot of money, but just to put it into context, Robin Hood, which was released that same year, earned $2 million in North America alone. So Nosferatu was, by all metrics, a flop. So if Nosferatu was such a flop, how did it become such a staple in vampire media? Well, in the United States, copyright laws are very different than they are in Germany. And because Dracula was already in the public domain in the United States of America, Nosferatu was able to become a cult classic that's largely regarded as a masterpiece of German expressionism. Now, while Nosferatu, unsurprisingly, doesn't have any black character and would seem to be irrelevant to this conversation, the film is worth mentioning because it is the first on-screen depiction of a vampire, starring Max Schreck as the vampire Count Orlok, who's more rat-like than bat-like. And I think through this inhuman performance, we can track the evolution of the on-screen vampire from 1922 all the way to 2025. But before we get to 2025, we can make a quick pit stop at 1931. Because in 1931, we get Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. And it's through Lugosi's rendition of the Transylvanian Count that we get the archetypal image of a vampire, one that has slicked back hair, pale skin, a floor-length black opera cape. And I know you're probably thinking, Dracula's not black. And to that I say, actually he kind of is.
I shall place a curse of suffering on you that will doom you to a living hell. A hunger, a wild, gnawing, animal hunger will grow in you. A hunger for human blood. Here you will starve for an eternity, torn by an unquenchable lust, I curse you with my name. You shall be Blacula.
Meet Blacula, the titular character of the 1972 blaxploitation film of the same name, starring William Marshall. Blacula opens in 1780 with African prince Mamuwalde visiting Count Dracula at his Transylvanian castle, asking for help to bring an end to the transatlantic slave trade. But Dracula, believing slavery to have merit, finds Mamuwalde's goal unrealistic and therefore refuses to help. Dracula then proceeds to make fetishistic comments about Mamuwalde's wife, Luva, implying that he would like to purchase her and then turn her into a sex slave.
Mine, I would willingly pay for so beautiful an addition to my household as your delicious wife.
Are you ill?
Oh, I meant no insult, Prince. It is a compliment for a man of my station to look with desire on one of your color.
That is the rudest nigga I've ever seen in my life.
Mamuwalde, refusing to suffer these indignities, decides to leave before the conversation can become any more tense than it already is. But Dracula summons his henchmen and has them imprison Mamuwalde in a coffin where he is set to spend the rest of eternity as a vampire, unable to save the love of his life while also bearing a name given to him by his captor. Fast forward almost 200 years later, a pair of antique dealers purchase the coffin and ship it to Los Angeles, where they are then consumed by Mamuwalde, now Blacula. Now, Blacula is a myth. He not only kills these antique dealers, but then he goes to the funeral home and watches as their loved ones grieve them. And it's there that he sees this woman named Tina, who so closely resembles his late wife Luva, who's been dead for 2 centuries, by the way. And Blacula spends essentially the rest of the movie following this woman, attempting to reclaim the love that was taken from him. What I find to be interesting about this film is vampirism operates as a metaphor for slavery. When Dracula turns Mamuwalde into a vampire, he strips him of his identity by renaming him Blacula, an act that so closely resembles the way that white enslavers forced their last names on enslaved people, denoting ownership. Dracula then proceeds to curse Mamuwalde with an eternity of suffering before locking him in a coffin, hidden in a crypt beneath his castle, preventing Mamuwalde not only from being able to save himself, but also preventing him from being able to save Luva's life as she's locked in the crypt as well, without any food, water, and eventually she presumably dies from a limited supply of oxygen. As I said before, Blacula starts in 1783 and then the narrative picks back up in the 1970s. I think it's important that we take a step back to better understand the whole picture, the context that Blacula exists in, and that context is the 1970s. So the 70s is a time in which we see Black people making incredible gains. In 1983, the Washington Post published a piece interpreting data from the census saying education was clearly one of the bright spots according to the census study. Between 1970 and 1982, the proportion of Blacks aged 25 to 34 who were high school graduates almost caught up with that of whites. The proportion of whites who were graduates jumped from 76 to 87%, but the Black gain was much more impressive, from 53 to 79%. Similarly, the percentage of Black people between the ages of 25 to 34 who had completed a year of college from only 15% in 1970 to 36% by 1982. Not only do we see an increase in education, but we also see an increase in Black homeownership. The number of Black homeowners increases from 2.6 million to 3.7 million, a 45% increase compared with a 26% increase for white. So that was a lot of numbers. But the point is, it sounds like Black people are doing just fine in the 70s, right? Well, that's not exactly true. You see, in 1972, the unemployment rate for Black people was 10.3%, which was nearly twice the unemployment rate for white Americans. And by 1982, it goes up to 18.9%, which is almost a 9% increase from what it was a decade earlier. In comparison to the white unemployment rate, which increases from 5% to 8.6%, which is almost a 4 percentage point increase. This has serious implications for the Black community in the 70s, with 34% of the community lying below the government's official poverty line. And we're also beginning to see a concurrent rise in single-parent households, an increase in divorce rates, children born out of wedlock, etc., etc.
Damn!
Now, if I'm starting to sound conservative, my apologies. But what I'm trying to get us to examine is the role that strategic economic exclusion plays in the destruction of the Black family unit and ultimately the Black community. I do sound like a hotep, don't I? Now, you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with Blacula? Well, Blacula is set in 1972 in Los Angeles, and this is important because there were a couple of things that had transpired in Los Angeles that could have informed the narrative choices made in Blacula. With the first of those being the deindustrialization of Los Angeles, which started in the mid-1960s and entailed the offshoring of manufacturing jobs to China and Mexico, a shift to automation, almost immediately led to a rise in unemployment rates, specifically amongst African American and Latino men, and widening the wealth gap between the working class and upper class families. In his 1990 book, City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles, scholar Mike Davis writes, since the late 1970s, every major sector of the Southern California economy, from tourism to apparel, has restructured itself around the increasing role of foreign trade and offshore investments. South Central LA, as we have indicated, has been the main loser in this transformation since Asian imports have closed factories without creating compensatory economic opportunities for local residents. Keep that in mind, we're going to be returning to this book later. So when we watch Blacula and we see urban decay and economic disinvestment evidenced by the gritty backdrop of South Central Los Angeles, this is one of the things that led to that. More importantly, while on the subject of South Central, we'd be remiss if we didn't have a conversation about the very neighborhood that Blacula takes place in, Watts. And I'm sure that was very intentional on the part of the director.
More than 1,500 people were in the streets, many hurling rocks and bottles at the police or anyone else, some attacking the cars of people, white or Negro, who just passed by.
For those of you who don't know the historical significance of Watts, Watts is a neighborhood most known for its 5-day riot against police brutality in 1965. The Watts riot started on August 11th when Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old black man, was pulled over by the police for driving under the influence. The police escalated the situation by not only striking Fry in the face with a baton, but then allegedly kicking a pregnant woman in the stomach, causing an uproar in the local community and leading to a riot that lasted until August 16th, when almost 14,000 members of the National Guard were brought into LA, with 34 people dying and 3,438 getting arrested. Well, 7 years after the Watts riots, William Crane, a black director, releases Blacula, which features a black vampire killing a police officer in a neighborhood known for resistance to state-sponsored violence. And similar to Marvel Comics' 1941 publishing of the now iconic image of Captain America punching Adolf Hitler, which was drawn and inked by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, two Jewish men, we get one of the first, if not the first, depiction in mainstream media of black superhuman resistance to oppression, which presumably provided a black audience with the same sense of catharsis they got when Black Panther beat up the KKK in Marvel's 1976 Jungle Action number 19, which is the same feeling black audiences probably got when they saw Chris get away with defending himself against the Armitages in 2017's Get Out. It's also probably the same feeling they got when Smoke got revenge on the KKK in 2025 Sinners. So it's in this film that we see the establishment of a precedent that later becomes a convention in black sci-fi, fantasy, horror. It's also in this film that we see the taking of something that was once white and the re-examination of it through a black lens. Because of Blacula, we get a slew of black horror films that often parody white horror projects. Among these are 1973's Blackenstein, which is Black Frankenstein, 1974's Abby, which is like the black version of The Exorcist, and 1976's Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde, which is the black version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So Blacula gives birth to not only the black horror movie, but it gives birth to the black parody movie, which paves the way for the Wayans brothers.
Hey, yo, dog. Does this shirt make me look gay?
Nah, man.
Cindy, the news is on.
What about now?
That little white girl done fell down the well. 50 black people get their ass beat by police today, but the whole world gotta stop for one little whitey down the hole.
And speaking of the Wayans brothers, two other black men who turned comedy into their family business are Eddie Murphy and the late Charlie Murphy, who starred in and co-wrote Wes Craven's 1995 film Vampyre in Brooklyn. Now, Vampyre in Brooklyn follows Eddie Murphy's character Maximilian, a full-blooded vampire from a tribe in the Caribbean.
Who the fuck are you?
I'm Maximilian. A connoisseur of death, you might say.
As he comes to Brooklyn in search of Angela Bassett's character, Detective Rita Veeder, half human, half vampire, keep that in mind, to mate with in order to save their dying race. In this film, vampirism represents the embracing of one's culture versus assimilating into the dominant culture, and we see this play out mainly through Angela Bassett's character. Now, I have to say, I am not cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs when it comes to this film. I do find it to be tonally inconsistent. I think that it tries its hand at so many different genres, and I don't know if it is particularly successful at that. So I'm not going to spend so much time talking about the film itself, but I would like to talk about its inclusion of Afro-Caribbean characters and the historical significance of Afro-Caribbeans in New York City. The story is set in Brooklyn, New York, and those of you who've never been to New York is a hub for immigrants. Nearly a quarter of Brooklyn's population is of Caribbean descent. Now, there are a few questions to ask, right? How does Brooklyn develop such a strong Caribbean presence, and what role did Afro-Caribbeans play in Black American history? Well, in a 2022 article for National Geographic, Melissa Noel writes, in the early half of the 20th century, the first wave of large-scale voluntary migration from the Caribbean to the United States began. These mostly Afro-Caribbean immigrants from English-speaking countries in the region, such as Jamaica and Barbados, sought greater economic stability and found work in America mainly as laborers. New York City was the most significant point of entry. In the 1940s, Caribbean immigrants filled labor shortages that rose during World War II and continued into the post-war period. In subsequent decades, New York City's West Indian community grew to new levels, partly due to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. It repealed over 40 years of restrictive and discriminatory immigration policies that favored people from Western Europe, while curtailing immigration from other countries. The act lifted national origin country quotas and replaced them with a system based on family reunification and employment. Over the ensuing years, most Caribbean immigrants in New York City settled in Brooklyn's Crown Heights, Canarsie, Flatbush neighborhoods where they worked in high-demand sectors such as healthcare, education, and domestic care. Keep that in mind. Today, some 20% of New York City's population of 8.8 million people can trace roots to the Caribbean. Now, the reason why Afro-Caribbean migration to the United States is so important because it helps shape our understanding of labor, organizing, and resistance in America. So if we go back all the way to the 1930s, we see widespread labor rebellions in the Caribbean, from sugar workers in St. Kitts protesting wage cuts in 1935 to oilfield workers in Trinidad going on strike in 1937, sugarcane and dock workers in Jamaica going on strike in 1938, to field workers in Guyana protesting low wages in 1939. And why this is important is because when Afro-Caribbean immigrants migrated to the United States, New York more specifically, we as in Black people benefit from their collective memories of organizing and resisting oppression and exploitation back in their countries of origin. For example, we have Claudia Jones and her work supporting domestic workers, nurses, and caregivers. We have Frank Crosswave and his work with ensuring Black workers were integrated into mainstream labor unions. We had Marvel Cook and her reports on the exploitation of Black domestic workers. We also get the half Barbadian, half Guyanese Shirley Chisholm, who in 1968 became the first Black woman elected to Congress, representing New York's 12th congressional district. And in 1972, she even became the first Black candidate for a major party nomination for the President of the United States. And she was also the first woman to run for the Democrat Party's presidential nomination. And while none of those things are explored in the film, I think it would have been interesting if the film had continued the tradition of the Black vampire as a symbol of resistance. Resistance against slavery, resistance against police brutality, resistance against exploitation. I think it would have added some much needed layers to the film. Now, one part of the film that I didn't mention, but I did tell you to pay attention to earlier, I want to see if you remember it, was in regards to Angela Bassett's character. So, two things about the film that I find to be particularly interesting. Both have something to do with Angela Bassett's character, Detective Rita Feeder. The first being, she's half human, half vampire, which if you are a fan of Black vampire media, you see where I'm going with this, right? And the second thing being, she's Detective Rita Feeder, as in she's a cop. And while I think this deserves exploring, I'm not sure if Vampire in Brooklyn is the film to do that with. So instead, I'm going to pivot to my favorite half vampire, half human, 100% cop, Blade. Blade is a cop. And there's a good reason why I say that, but before I give you the reason, I need to give you the context. So, for those of you who haven't seen Blade, not to be mistaken for the MCU movie that's set to come out in, I don't even know if that movie's still coming out, to be honest. Blade is an action horror movie starring Wesley Snipes that was released in 1998. And the film was made on a budget of $45 million, and it grossed $131.2 million in the box office, making it a commercial success. Not only was it a commercial success, but it was Marvel's first successful film, paving the way for the MCU, or as Martin Scorsese likes to call it, cinema.
I was bring this to somebody else's club. That's sad.
There's a good reason why Blade is a cop, and that's because it's the 90s, and everybody is a cop in the 90s. And when I mean everybody, I mean everybody. Angela Bassett in Vampire in Brooklyn, Ice-T in Law & Order SVU, Ice-T in New Jack City, Martin Lawrence and Will Smith in Bad Boys, Malik Yoba in New York Undercover, Forrest Whitaker in Downtown, Eddie Murphy in Metro, Ella Joyce in Set It Off, Morgan Freeman in Kiss the Girls. I could go on and on and on and on, but I'm gonna spare you, because the 90s was the decade of the Black cop. But what caused this phenomenon? Well, remember how earlier I was talking about how the deindustrialization of Los Angeles led to a spike in unemployment rates? Well, what I intentionally left out was the fact that as unemployment rates began to go up in Los Angeles, so did the crime rates. You see, the full quote from City of Quartz Excavating the Future in Los Angeles is actually, since the late 1970s, every major sector of the Southern California economy, from tourism to apparel, has restructured itself around the increasing role of foreign trade and offshore investment. South Central LA, as we have indicated, has been the main loser in this transformation, since Asian imports have closed factories without creating compensatory economic opportunities for local residents. The specific genius of the Crips has been their ability to insert themselves into a leading circuit of international trade. Through crack, they have discovered a vocation for the ghetto in LA's new world economy. So those last two sentences I admittedly left out just because I didn't want to spoil the direction the video was heading in, which is how the crack cocaine epidemic set the stage for the 1994 crime bill.
That was Bill.
So, because of the crack cocaine epidemic in the late 1980s, early 90s, the violent crime rate skyrocketed before ultimately peaking at 716 violent crimes per 100,000 people in 1991. The public, growing fearsome, began to pressure both Democrat and Republican leaders to adopt a tough-on-crime stance, which is what soon-to-be President Bill Clinton would end up campaigning on in 1992. And by 1994, the infamous crime bill was passed by both the House and the Senate, and then signed into law by President Clinton, leading to billions of dollars being allocated to the hiring of more police officers, the building of more prisons, states enforcing mandatory minimums, and truth in sentencing laws, which required offenders to serve longer prison sentences and caused the number of state and federal correctional facilities to rise by 43% from 1990 to 2005. A really great book to check out regarding this topic is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Now, although the 1994 crime bill had devastating effects on the black community, and although a 1993 Gallup poll found that 74% of black Americans felt that the justice system treated them more harshly than it treated white Americans, that didn't stop support for the crime bill. According to a 1994 survey done by Gallup, 58% of black Americans supported the 1994 crime bill, in contrast to the only 49% of white Americans who supported it. So what does that have to do with my theory about Blade being a black cop? Well, in the 90s, not only do we see an increase in films about black people experiencing gang violence, i.e. Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, and New Jack City, but we also see an increase in films depicting black people as law enforcement. You got Bad Boys, Die Hard with a Vengeance, Lethal Weapon, and my personal favorite, Rush Hour. More specifically, Rush Hour 2, right? Now, in Rush Hour 2, there's a brief scene where Detective James Carter of the LAPD, portrayed by Chris Tucker, seeks intel from an old friend named Kenny, portrayed by Don Cheadle. And it's in this scene that Detective Carter barges into Kenny's Chinese restaurant without a warrant, disrupting the patrons. Kenny's naturally upset because Carter's mere presence is enough to harm Kenny's business, which doubles as an illegal gambling den. And in this scene, we see the tension between the two, a rogue cop and a not-so-law-abiding citizen. And while this tension between police officers and the people they police is nothing new, the unique history of policing in America as it pertains to the black community makes it interesting. You see, modern-day policing stems from slave patrols, which date all the way back to the 1700s. And because of that, there's long-standing tensions between black Americans and the police. According to Statista, black people, while only comprising about 13.4% of the population in the United States of America, account for 22% of fatal police shootings. This creates a weird relationship between police officers who happen to be black and the black communities that they police. To some, black police officers are heroes, and to others, they're traitors. And I think Blade operates as a supernatural black police officer. He is a half vampire who slays other vampires for a living, and that's just as paradoxical as being a black person who's also a police officer. And this is a theme we see not only in Blade, but we also see in Vampire in Brooklyn with Angela Bassett's character, who's also half human, half vampire, 100% police officer. And what makes Blade different than other black vampires is vampirism isn't a tool for resistance, it's the bane of his existence. It's a chronic illness that Blade actively fights against. It's something he's ashamed of and refuses to give into. It represents the trauma surrounding the death of his mother. He becomes a vampire slayer in the name of protecting others, and in the process, he hurts people just like him. I think what's also interesting about Blade is similar to how becoming a police officer provides black people with certain privileges that everyday black people don't have. Blade is only half vampire. He gets to enjoy privileges that the other vampires don't get to enjoy. He's impervious to daylight. He's impervious to religious artifacts, stake to the heart, garlic. He doesn't need an invitation to enter a home. And he has a human soul, while the other vampires live underground, quite literally in the shadows, which is similar to the Morlocks from X-Men 97. Well, it's actually not X-Men 97. It's the TV show that came out in the 90s. I needed to segue to the next topic. which, speaking of the 90s, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was released in the 90s, and don't quote me on this, but this show gives birth to one of the most inescapable phenomena of the 21st century, which is the teenage vampire. What is the teenage vampire? Well, the teenage vampire is typically a young male who was turned into a vampire before he could finish puberty. He's young, he's brooding, he's effeminate, he's protective, he's hairless, he's Peter Pan but with fangs, he's passionate, he's loving, he's avoidant, but most importantly, he's not black. And it's in 2005 we get the most popular teenage vampire, which is Edward from Twilight.
Paper cut.
Now, my knowledge of Twilight is rather limited. I know Bella and Edward named their child something stupid. I know Jacob also nicknamed her something stupid. I know he imprinted on their daughter, and most importantly, I know there were no black vampires in Twilight. And before you say there was that one black guy in the Twilight movie, I bet you can't tell me his name.
Who is it? Who is it? Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it? Who is it?
And this wasn't by accident, by the way. The author of Twilight said that black people couldn't be vampires because there was a bleaching agent in their blood that would prevent them from developing melanin. And I know you're probably thinking, well, if Twilight isn't famous for its inclusion of black people, then why mention it at all? Well, I think that we can deduce a lot from this purposeful exclusion because it actually says a lot about the direction the entertainment industry was heading in at that time. I mean, think about UPN's merger with CW in 2006, which led to the cancellation of many beloved black-led shows like Eve, One-on-One, and Girlfriends, in favor of shifting programming focus to white-led sci-fi fantasy shows like Supernatural, Smallville, and The Vampire Diaries. What we get from that purposeful exclusion is the idea that black people can't be vampires, even though we had been vampires since Uriah Derek D'Arcy's book in 1819. Now, I will give an honorable mention to My Babysitter's a Vampire on Disney Channel, which featured Vanessa Morgan as a black teen vampire, but that was in 2011. And it isn't until 2022 that we get the next best project with a black vampire lead. And that would be in AMC's Interview with the Vampire. Now, the show follows Louis Depointe-Dulac, who many of you may recognize from this now viral meme. And those of you who haven't seen the show, let me tell you what's happening in the scene. So, Louis is hanging up a sign that says, "Colored only, no whites allowed." Well, Louis is a pimp, and he does this in response to finding out that his property was sold to him by a group of racist white male competitors who knew that anti-soliciting laws were about to go into effect in New Orleans and were sure to force successful black owners both out of business and out of the area. The only options Louis had were to either relocate his brothel to the quarter, where he would immediately lose ownership over the azalea due to anti-black discriminatory laws that would prevent him from operating there, or to resell it to the very white people who tricked him into buying it. But if he resells it, he's going to have to give them an 85% discount. So that's why he hangs up the sign, and then he eventually kills Alderman Fenwick and essentially starts a race war that leads to a massacre of Storyville's black pocket. But that's beside the point. AMC's Interview with the Vampire follows the race-bended vampire Louis Depointe-Dulac as he tells the story of his life to a renowned journalist named Daniel Malloy. Now, out of all of these projects, Interview with the Vampire does by far the best job in incorporating history into the plot. So Louis' flashback begins in 1910's New Orleans with the Storyville district, which was a legally established red light district, which existed from 1898 to 1917. It had brothels, saloons, and music halls. It was known for its influence on the development of jazz music. Now, what makes New Orleans interesting is, unlike other slave-holding states, New Orleans had a distinct racial history that granted rights to a free class of people of color. But 1896's Plessy versus Ferguson led to an erosion of this distinction, leading to segregated streetcars in 1902, segregated public facilities by 1910, and a law prohibiting miscegenation in 1908, which is important because Louis is not only in a gay relationship, but an interracial one with a white man. So we're going to skip ahead to the 1940s. Spoiler alert, Claudia and Louis are traveling to Europe before settling down in Paris, France. While in Paris, Louis develops an affinity for photography, similar to the slew of African-American artists who expatriated themselves to Europe in the mid-20th century, like James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Chester Himes, William Gardner Smith, Frank Yerby, Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, Gordon Heath. And I think this inclusion was very interesting. I think the inclusion of this was very intentional. It was very of the time. Now, we're going to skip ahead because Interview with the Vampire is a non-linear story told in a non-linear way, so it would only be fitting to follow that device of storytelling. Now we're in 1973, and 1973 is 5 years after the Civil Rights Movement, which dismantles Jim Crow and outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, public accommodations, employment, and federally assisted programs, and expanded voting rights for African Americans. 1973 is also 6 years after the Supreme Court strikes down laws prohibiting interracial marriage, which is important because Louis, once again, is in an interracial relationship with a white man, but they can't get married yet because Obergefell v. Hodges doesn't happen for another 42 years. So in 1973, Louis is in San Francisco, a hub for gay culture and activism. In San Francisco, in 1970, they had a gay in. In 1972, they had a Gay Liberation Day parade, which eventually turns into San Francisco Pride. And what's significant about Louis meeting Daniel Malloy at a gay bar in San Francisco is the two meet 4 years before the election of Harvey Milk, the first openly gay man to be elected to public office in California. Milk was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and spent almost 11 months in office before being assassinated on November 27, 1978 by former Supervisor Dan White, who'd been denied his job back by Milk. During his time in office, Harvey Milk sponsored Article 33 of San Francisco's Human Rights Ordinance, which bans discrimination based on sexual orientation in public accommodations, housing, and employment. The bill was passed by a vote of 11-1 and then passed into law. So the show ends with Louis and Lestat in Louisiana, 7 years after Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court ruling that says that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. In all 50 states, DC, and insular areas must perform and recognize the marriages of same-sex couples on the same terms and conditions as the marriages of opposite-sex couples with equal rights and responsibilities. So how does vampirism operate in this narrative? Well, in Interview with a Vampire, vampirism levels the playing field. It gives Louis the opportunity to, at the very least, look eye to eye with the very white man who's always looking down on him. But more than that, immortality gives Louis the opportunity to reap the benefits of social justice movements, which is more than what his mortal peers could say. And so that brings us back to Sinners. One of the most interesting things about Sinners that I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about is the incorporation of wooden nickels or plantation scripts. Now, for context, at the beginning of the movie, Smoke and Stack used money that they stole from the Chicago's Irish and Italian mobs to purchase an old sawmill that they plan to turn into a juke joint that sells fish plates and bootleg alcohol, which is a really big deal because the story takes place in 1932, which was the penultimate year of the Prohibition era. So naturally, you have patrons who are coming to this establishment for a sip of alcohol. But what happens when those patrons don't have money to pay for said alcohol? Well, in Sinners, there's a scene where a man tries to buy alcohol from Annie at the bar, but he doesn't have enough money to pay for it. So he offers to make up for the rest in wooden nickels or plantation scripts. Annie, being a hoodoo practitioner who believes money to be the root of all evil, and also a local businesswoman who accepts wooden nickels at her establishment, sees nothing wrong with allowing the man to pay the only way he can, much to the chagrin of Smoke, who insists that the brothers will never break even if they start doing charity. So let's take a second to contextualize that in history. So on January 16, 1865, after consulting prominent African-American community leaders, Union General William T. Sherman issues his Special Order No. 15, which confiscates a strip of coastline stretching all the way from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Florida, which also includes the Georgia Sea Island and mainland as property of the now victorious Union, and orders it to be redistributed to newly freed Black Americans as reparations. Now, if you've ever heard the saying 40 acres and a mule, Special Order 15 is where it comes from. However, if you do the math and add up all of the territories included in this order, it's not 40 acres. It's not even 400 acres. I want you to guess how many acres it is. The amount of acres that Sherman wanted to redistribute to newly freed Black people was 400,000 acres of land. And not even because he was an ally who believed in equality amongst the races, but because he wanted to punish rice plantation owners for siding with the Confederacy in the Civil War. Now, in the year 2025, we know Black people didn't get reparations for slavery. So what happened? Well, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson took over as president of the United States, reversed Sherman's order, and returned most of the land to its pre-war owners, eliminating any chance newly freed Black people had of establishing economic independence. So, because newly freed Black people never received reparations for centuries of enslavement, they had no other choice but to go back to working for the very people who had enslaved them, some of whom they actually fought against in the Civil War. And because slavery was now illegal, plantation owners had to come up with a new way to cheat their laborers out of their earnings. So how did they do that? Well, remember those wooden nickels and plantation scripts? Wooden nickels and plantation scripts were a form of currency paid to Black sharecroppers by white plantation owners, with the biggest downside being they could only be used at the local plantation store. Just to underscore how fucked up that is, I'm gonna have to recontextualize this through a modern lens, okay? So imagine you were kidnapped by the owner of a grocery store, and that person spent years raping, torturing, separating, abusing, mutilating you and your relatives, and forcing you guys to work at their store. And after a while, you guys are finally able to sue that person in a court of law, and you win, but you don't get any money. So you have to go back to working for this person who agrees to let you live in their attic, and they'll even pay you for labor, but only in credits that can be used at that store, preventing you and your family from ever being able to save up enough money and escape your captor. Well, that's what wooden nickels and plantation scripts were. A way to create a cycle of dependency and debt amongst a generation of newly freed black people. It's things like this that show white supremacy's ability to regenerate itself, like beheaded Hydra, right? We cut off slavery, but sharecropping in the prison industrial complex grew back in its place. So we've seen the black vampire through slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, mass incarceration, all the way to a post-pandemic America. And what have we learned? Well, two things. Vampirism, oddly enough, has been a very useful tool at humanizing black people in media, giving us license to feel a full range of emotions, including rage, which is so often reserved for white people exclusively. And secondly, when I think about the black vampire, I'm reminded of a line from Hamilton, the American musical. Lin-Manuel Miranda says, "What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see." And I draw parallels between that and the final speech Dr. King delivered before he was assassinated. I think what makes the black vampire so interesting is the black vampire gets the chance to survive slavery, survive Reconstruction, survive Jim Crow, survive the civil rights movement, survive in many ways antithetical to Dr. King's mountaintop speech.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
If you made it all the way to the end of this video, first I want to thank you for watching, listening, and participating in this conversation. I want to know, who are some of your favorite black vampires? We have a lot of really cool subjects to talk about in the future, and I don't want you to miss out. So don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to the channel.